Okay, well, thank you all for joining us and joining us on a cold January morning for Finposium 2022, and it's the topic is from sustainability to impact and looking at ESG issues, which is a super important topic for us to consider today. So today is January 14th, 2022. Just a reminder that the views expressed are those of the speakers only, and that this is being recorded for the future. So welcome, and thank you for joining us. Thank you for our sponsors who have made this possible. Resolution, the Smith Impact Initiative, the Smith School of Business, Resolve Asset Management, and the Masters of Finance program at Queen's University. All have contributed to this day and to making a really interesting and valuable conference come together. So here are some basic rules as we begin. To make it interactive, we've allowed people to have their microphones available later on, but make sure your all sounds are off unless you are a speaker or you're in a breakout room speaking with someone. You're welcome to submit questions to the guests in the chat for the moderator. The moderator will typically be the one to ask those questions unless you are in those breakout rooms. Generally, goes without saying, please be respectful and courteous for the panelists and the speakers and everyone involved. The speakers and panelists may be available to speak afterwards in breakout rooms, and you're going to be able to select the individual breakout room that you might want to join. But within this conference, we have a lot to go through today, and the conference will be recorded. So you can feel free to turn your camera off if you don't want to be included in that recording as well. Here is the basic introduction of what we're going to do today. They're going to do the introduction. We have a keynote speaker, Bruce Lourie. We have Mark Foran from Rally Assets speaking. Then we're going to have breakout rooms. Then we will move on at 10:45 to Sean Cleary from the Institute of Sustainable Finance. After that, we'll have John Larson, who runs impact investments for Avenue Capital Group. And then we are going to have an industry panel with an electric vehicle manufacturer, a materials mining firm, Global Batteries, and a clean energy firm, InStream, to talk about the opportunities and challenges for industry today in ESG and sustainability. And then we're going to have another breakout room from there to give people a little bit of a break and to talk to some of those folks that have already presented. Then we're going to have an analytics panel. Analytics in sustainability, very important topic. So we've got some great guests from New York and other places that are tackling this problem. At 2:15, we're going to have a talk by Jonathan Arajo Redbird from the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation, and he's going to talk about his views on impact investments and what it means to invest for 7 generations. And then we're going to have another breakout room chance to talk, take a little bit of a break for 10 minutes. We're going to come back and talk about asset management and have some speakers from RBC and KPMG, ESG consultants talking about how things have changed, what's changing in the market, what's changing for the future of asset management, because it is a time of great change, but also great opportunity. And then we're going to have a really important part of this, which is we have an impact hackathon to review from 4 p.m. And that's where individual teams who have come together. We've had a total of 12 teams that came together to quickly address a specific problem in impact investments and to give their best ideas for us to think about. So we're going to have a group of expert judges that will review that, and we will pick winners after that. Finally, we'll have a little bit of time for breakout rooms and we're networking with other participants if you want to connect. One of the goals of this conference is to bring together academia, students, industry, asset managers, capital allocators, as well as capital users and those that want to help that intermediation process happen. So with that, we're also going to ask you later on, if you can, we'll ask you multiple times to fill out this Survey Monkey, which is really just an anonymous survey to just tell us your thoughts and ideas of who you are and how you feel about sustainability going forward. So before I've introduced the conference, I'm introducing myself. My name is John Aikman, and I am adjunct faculty with Queen's University, as well as I am the head of Resolution Investments, which is a sustainability based investment firm. So these are my contact details, and I guess from there, I have the distinct pleasure now of introducing Bruce Lourie. And I will not try and do him justice, but Bruce Lourie is the head of the Ivy Foundation. He is a best-selling author. He's a policy expert, an entrepreneur himself, and he's an award-winning global sustainability leader. He's made major contributions in different areas, particularly for me, my personal favorite was his books on plastics and toxins, and he is probably responsible for my home having no plastic in it today as a result of his leadership and his thinking about this important topic. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Bruce Lourie for his presentation. So thank you very much, Bruce, for joining us today. We really appreciate it, and we look forward to your talk.
Great. Well, thank you so much, John, and everyone at Queen's and the Smith School. It's always really a pleasure for me to participate in the Queen's Smith School work. I think there's just such good work being done, and I love the hackathon idea. I think it's fun to see how that unfolds. And I want in particular thank Sean Cleary for all of his outstanding efforts to really drive the sustainable finance field and build the Institute for Sustainable Finance. So Sean, I know you're going to be speaking shortly, but I just wanted to put that out there. We all really appreciate the work that you've been doing. And when we were first pulling all of this stuff together, and maybe I'll share my screen here. While we get going, and let me know if that looks okay. That looked good, John.
That's great.
Thanks. So when we were first pulling all of this stuff together, around sustainable finance, Sean and I used to kind of say, well, Sean was the finance guy and I was the sustainable guy. And so when we're both in a room together, you've got sustainable finance. So I'm going to stick to the sustainable part of that equation because that's what I know. And what I thought I would do today is just give a little bit of a context around net zero. And as I'm sure most of you have heard, countries are committing to net zero, governments are committing to net zero, oil companies, businesses, cities, states around the world. So the title of my talk is Net Zero Changes Everything. And I just think it's an important context in which, sustainability, sustainable finance, and ultimately, climate change is being framed. And so what I thought I would do is just give a little teeny bit of history of how we got here. What is net zero? Climate risk and opportunity. I'll just for a moment talk about resilient recovery because we're still very much on everyone's minds is the pandemic recovery and how do we link investment and transition to a new economy to a resilient recovery. And then finally, talk a little bit about this idea of transition pathways and priorities and basically the idea that we are now getting to the point where there are some very clear pathways to net zero and how do we just kind of dig down on those and start the process of investing in those transition pathways. And I often, just from my own academic background, studying sustainability, typically we saw these three elements of sustainability as a Venn diagram and where do they intersect. But I think, where we're moving to now is this idea that, the economy essentially is there to serve society, and society can only function within ecology. So rather than just this little intersection of those three and trying to find the sweet spot, we need to develop plans and policies for sustainability whereby we really understand that nothing is going to succeed going down the road if we're not working within the boundaries of our sort of the ecological limits of life. So I like to raise that issue, especially for people that might not be studying ecology in their university programs. Another way of looking at it, which is one of my favorite cartoonists, Gary Larson, and the challenge that we face ahead, with the world looking pretty bleak, and we're all sitting here with brains the size of walnuts, trying to manage our way. So some days that feels like where we're at, and certainly some days with COVID that feels like where we're at. So, but I'll avoid that subject for today. This is my own definition for net zero. I just wanted to kind of write something out that is clear to me and clear to people that maybe aren't working on this from a technical perspective. But the idea for net zero is quite straightforward. Basically, it includes all efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions at the source, so that's the mitigation piece, together with any natural or technical methods of removing residual greenhouse gases. And that can be either from emission sources directly, so carbon capture and storage, or directly from air. And you're probably seeing more and more on direct air carbon capture technology as a potential. And the result of all emission reductions and all those residual removals must net out at zero. And for many people now, they're looking at the point at which we start going below zero and extracting carbon out of the atmosphere, because the thought is that we're probably not going to get to the levels of emission reductions that we need to by 2030 and 2050. So we're going to need those technologies post 2050. And this is a graph that came out in a study last year in Nature, and basically this is just a really great a visual representation of what getting to net zero really means. And I think what's most important, and if you kind of focus in the middle area of the chart where the arrows are going up and down, you start to see that CO2 removal doesn't really get seriously at scale until post 2050, and really not until you get into the kind of post 2080 time frame. So these aren't dates that you often hear because it's quite a bit out from the 2050 target. But the idea is, and really the point of this message is, that we have to focus on the mitigation. So actually reducing emissions at the source as much as we can between now and 2050, recognizing that the CO2 removal technologies probably aren't going to be scalable and cost effective until post 2050. And there's certainly differences of opinion on that, but I tend to think that this is probably an accurate representation. So there are a few tricky parts to net zero, and I think just as an indication, if you've got major oil companies and small towns and cities and European countries and North American countries all saying they're going to get to net zero, then it must mean that people have different definitions of net zero, and that is absolutely true. So just a few of the things here, does it refer to carbon dioxide emissions or all greenhouse gas emissions? John, you mentioned data. I mean, this is going to be something where data availability and analytical capabilities are going to be absolutely critical in terms of how we measure and account for net zero. And again, are we looking at, in terms of the data that we're capturing, is it global? Is it by country? Is it by sector? Are we looking at whole supply chain? So a lot of complexity in how we manage and account for net zero calculations. And then there's going to be a lot of complexity around around credits and who's tracking this and who decides and who if the whole global offset market. How do you account for the different efforts in terms of emission reductions and then finally, which is the graph I just showed you, which is really the extent to which I would say there are differing opinions on how much of net zero is going to be through carbon capture and removal, and how much is going to be through direct emission reductions and mitigation. And so if you look at where the oil companies in Canada are going, for example, they're basically on a track whereby they believe that they can continue to produce as much oil in 2050 as they do today, but that they'll be able to capture the emissions from the oil production through emission carbon capture technology. And then of course that doesn't really address the issue of the downstream, or what are called Scope 3 emissions, which are the emissions of oil burning in homes, or gas burning in homes. So anyway, a lot of complexity. I don't want to get into it all, but just so that there's more to it than meets the eye, as we often know on these things. However, I actually am a big fan of net zero as a reframing of climate issues. It really gets us beyond what have been often fruitless debates around targets and timelines. We've gotten so bogged down by are we looking at 12% reduction by 2003 from 1992 with a baseline? Just everyone just kind of tunes out when they hear that. So net zero by 2050 is just a nice simple concept, on the surface. I would say most importantly, it takes us away from an emission reduction paradigm to a net zero paradigm. And so it's really moving this from kind of a problem orientation of how do we reduce these emissions, to a solution orientation of what does a net zero economy look like, and how do we transition. And then again, the graph that I put up shows this time scale that's really important to understand. And so 2030 is the other big date that everyone talks about in terms of climate reductions. That's where the Paris Agreement is focused, and you'll hear about the 1.5 degrees target or the 2-degree target. So what's critical in all of the net zero thinking is we're trying to get net zero to 2050, but of course 2030 is between now and 2050, and we have targets that we need to get through in 2030. But I won't. There's some interesting nuances around that, but I'll maybe if there's questions we can get into that some more. And as I said, it's supported widely, the net zero idea. So what does net zero mean in terms of kind of key messages for people? It creates an inclusive conversation, so you can actually sit at a table with a wide range of participants in the economy and actually talk about net zero. No one's debating it any longer. There is this idea, a little phrase that I use is "don't get caught in the net," which is, some of the netting out stuff is going to, I think, delay the focus on the actual emission reduction. So we need to really make sure that we don't kind of get caught just in the net idea, and we focus on the zero idea. I think we're getting to the point now where there's more certainty than uncertainty in what we need to do. There's global consensus around major pathways, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And then really, I think the strategy going forward is that we have to move quickly on the pathways that are clear. And when I mean pathways, these are basically either sector or system transition pathways that get us to net zero. And then there's some pathways that are very complicated, some sectors that are very complicated, and we need to just understand and do more research in those. So when we talk about net zero approaches to climate change, really what we're talking about is this great global economic and social transition. So this is no longer simply kind of an environmental idea. This of course is and exactly the work that you are all doing here. This is fundamental to what the economy looks like, what the investment world looks like, and And I think as much as anything, what we're seeing is with all of the recent floods, fires, and disaster, this is something that is not only about economic risk, but of course very much about human risk. And so just these numbers come out regularly, but one just actually a number I saw 2 days ago with weather-related climate disasters costing $280 billion in 2021. So this is a significant a significant economic issue for the world, in addition to, of course, all the human risk. So at the same time, we're also seeing more and more the opportunities for investment and economic growth. And this was a paper that came out that suggests that there's a $90 trillion infrastructure investment opportunity just between now and 2030. So massive amounts of capital have to be mobilized and shifted into the net zero transition. So not only, as we shift capital and do we have economic opportunity, there will be huge economic benefits if we do this well. And so a report a couple of years ago from called the New Climate Economy Report out of the UK suggests a $26 trillion economic benefit for the world. So big numbers. And then I referenced the $280 billion, but what we're seeing now is, we're basically optimistically, what came out of the COP meeting is we're on a path to 1.8 degrees. That's what I think it was the IEA that calculated if everybody does, or maybe it was the IPCC or COP, but if everyone does everything that they have committed to, as in all of the governments of the world, and they deliver on those commitments, we should be able to keep things at 1.8 degrees. Of course, the Paris target was 2 degrees with sort of a stretch goal of 1.5. So we're kind of in the realm of what basically going to avoid massive disaster. I was really struck at an event I was at a few years ago where Thomas Buberl, the CEO of AXA, basically said that there's no point in even looking at scenarios of 3 and 4 degrees in terms of the insurance industry, because once we get into that range of warming, basically nothing is going to be insurable. So a pretty sobering comment from the global insurance sector. And then for all of you here, I think what's really critical is, climate risk ultimately equals financial risk. And so for countries like Canada that are still heavily dependent on oil and gas production, extraction, and export, we're on one hand have a significant opportunity to reduce our emissions, but at the same time, we've got challenges in terms of how do we replace that economic activity. And it also puts us at more economic risk than most countries around the world, because it isn't really Canada that decides how much oil and gas gets used around the world. It's other countries. And of course, a significant amount of our oil and gas gets exported to the US. So it's not, Canada's not going to be deciding the future of electric vehicles. It's really going to be the rest of the world. So we can't be left behind. And then, I touched on, the climate risk and human risk. And of course, we saw ample evidence of that, even in Canada this year in the West with the fires. And this is only going to increase going forward. But, again, the good news here is that capital markets can play a major role in driving a sustainable transition that supports economic growth. And I think all of the work that you're doing and the work that the Institute for Sustainable Finance is doing is really figuring out how do we accelerate that capital that's going into a sustainable transition. So when we look at this shift in capital, rather than just thinking of it as solving climate change or solving environmental issues, what this will do is really transform, how we build cities, how we move ourselves and move goods, how we grow food, generate and use energy. So again, if we think about transforming the world to a more sustainable future, this is really the opportunity that we have right now to make sure that the investments are aligned, essentially to this kind of better future. In terms of, I mentioned at the outset, I was going to touch on this task force for resilient recovery, which I was involved in last summer. And basically, it was to look at to try to figure out this alignment between, post-pandemic recovery, investment in a future resilient economy, and how do you align sort of some of the ideas of net zero with job growth and economic activity. And so we came up with what we called the 5 bold moves that Canada needs to take. And there a lot of research and analysis went behind each of these. But just very quickly to give you an idea, when I talked about pathways, these are the kinds of pathways that I'm talking about. So investing in climate resilient and energy efficient buildings. The building sector in Canada is still going to be one of the toughest to deal with in terms of getting to net zero. So we really need to make investments to decarbonize buildings. And while we're making those investments in decarbonization, we also need to be looking at climate resilience. So buildings that are resilient to heat, not built in flood zones, et cetera. A lot of opportunity basically to improve the building stock, and significant opportunities for lower income building stock improvements that have significant social benefits. Second, jumpstart Canada's production and adoption of zero emission vehicles. I mean, this is absolutely critical, especially for anyone from Ontario that knows how important the automotive sector is to the Ontario economy. And if we're not ahead of the game, and to be blunt, we're not, we have a huge risk of losing out on the zero emission vehicle manufacturing. And then, of course, the Americans aren't making it easy for us right now with protectionist policies to kind of prevent the import of Canadian vehicles. Anyway, clean energy, huge. I spent a ton of time on that. Won't go into it. It's fairly straightforward. And then there's interesting work around, nature-based solutions and how do we look at, particularly in the agriculture sector, a lot of really important work on net zero, and then more generally just growing clean competitiveness and jobs, and the policies that help us do that. And so, excuse me, I won't spend any time here other than to show that, in our analysis, and this is actually out of the IEA, but we did some Canadian specific work as well. You can see that the job creation per dollar invested tends to be more in the sustainable side of things. So if you look at this, you can see that building retrofits in particular create a lot of jobs for every dollar invested, and they're jobs that are distributed across communities and across the country. So important when you're looking at resilient recovery. So for Canada, what does this mean? I think that we really need to look at and start to imagine what is our economy going to be based on in 2050. What are the sectors where Canada has a competitive advantage? And I won't go into this in much detail, but there is some really great work coming out right now out of a combination of organizations that I'll just mention them. One is called PICS, the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions, doing really interesting work on industrial competitiveness. And they've partnered with the Sustainable Prosperity Institute in Ottawa and the Transition Accelerator in Calgary. And it's for me the clearest research and analysis I've ever seen looking at Canada's kind of clean competitiveness advantage going forward. So I'm happy to send stuff around at some point to anyone, John or Sean, on that. But it's really, really eye-opening work, I would call it. And this is just one example of how to understand transition pathways. This was a report put together by the Transition Accelerator with some support from the Smart Prosperity. I said Sustainable Prosperity, the Smart Prosperity Institute. And again, this is something you can look up. It's available online, but it's meant to actually help people with decision making around, specific technological, almost like technological likelihoods within different sectors going forward. So a lot of really interesting practical information in this report. So I think I touched on a lot of this, but basically in the work that we're doing these days at the Ivy Foundation, we're sort of using what we call a transition lens. So everything really is, just to reinforce what I was saying earlier, transitioning transportation systems, food systems, energy production systems. It's this idea of, we know where we need to get to now in 2050. How do we transition? And again, just to repeat, what are those pathways? And the work of the Transition Accelerator that I just referenced is really looking at the complexity of transition. So this isn't just a technological or a financial issue. This is, as much as anything, a challenge around social issues like individual acceptance of change or understanding of change, political issues. So it's really, how do you bring to bear this much more complex dynamic that will ultimately bring people along as we're making change and transitioning. And I mean, ultimately the goal is, as I noted here, is really shaping the systems to deliver effective, equitable, sustainable services and systems. So how can we shape those? And of course, finance is going to be a big part of that. And just to give you a quick sense of what we're talking about in terms of where we're trying to get to with net zero in 2050 in a schematic. If you and we have the current graph, which I didn't put up today, but you would see that it's very hard for me to point at my screen because you can't tell what I'm pointing at. But if you look at the upper left and you see the gray fossil fuels, that would now be sort of where electricity is today. So basically, the majority of energy end use is through fossil fuel. Of course, transportation, building heating, industrial heating, agricultural equipment. But in 2050, that will almost certainly be primarily electric. So how do we actually get to an economy where the end uses are electrified, the electricity system is robust and modernized to support all of that electrification, and then where do we have other pieces fitting in? And what is producing that electricity? So my view is, we shouldn't be arguing about what kind of electricity we're producing as long as it's zero carbon. And then finally, really figuring out what are the pieces that we can't do with electricity and what is going to be providing that energy. And our sense is that we'll have a significant opportunity for hydrogen fuel. And that's going to be very much in the long haul freight. So it could be ships, heavy trucking, things like that, buses, and then we're always going to have fossil fuel somewhere. So, but I think the fossil fuel will be limited to very specialized uses. And then by 2050, we should start seeing the carbon capture and storage technology that will take the carbon off of the fossil fuel production. So that's our kind of vision of where we're going to be in 2050. And of course, the timelines and exact sizes of these bubbles are all still very much debatable. And that was the kind of academic view of the world. This is my simple-minded view of the world, which is we have old energy systems, we have new energy systems, and really the question is, to what extent are we, ramping down the old energy systems while ramping up the new energy systems, where do those lines cross? What's the slope of those lines? And that's really, for me, in simple terms, what the transition is all about. And I'll zip through this just because I'm getting toward the end of my time here. But there's lots of evidence on, why electrification is going to be a big part of the solution. Canada right now, over 80% of our electricity is non-greenhouse gas emitting. And so we've got strong electricity, very strong electricity industry and expertise, but we're not that well set up in terms of a future modernized grid where we'll probably see, the need for a doubling or tripling of our electricity grid. We aren't that great at building infrastructure quickly. We aren't very good at integrating our electricity systems across provinces or with the US. So a lot of work needs to be done to prepare ourselves for that. And just a little bit of detail on that, but I'm not really going to go through all of that right now, other than to say that this whole concept of grid modernization is really critical. And this is, of course, where the social political side of it is really important and often a significant barrier to Canada moving forward. So just to wrap up again, it's important that we don't get caught in the net on these things. We have to avoid investments in what are called dead-end pathways. So a dead-end pathway is something that might look promising in terms of an emissions reduction in the near term, but actually locks in emissions for the long term. So an example might be replacing, say, coal with natural gas. So you might be making a big investment in natural gas, but you need to understand that the natural gas itself has to be phased out at some point. So you don't want to be locking in 30-year investments in technologies that are going to continue to emit greenhouse gases. So we need to prioritize the real emission reductions from from research and things that are just looking optimistic or too far down the road. And that gets us into understanding like the time sequencing of the net zero transition and investment. And we really need to value certainty over uncertainty. And the Canadian Institute for Climate Choice has put together a scenario study on getting to net zero. And they use the language of safe bets versus wild cards. So safe bets are the things that we know we can invest in today and are going to deliver, emissions reductions and economic opportunity. So we really need to focus on the safe bets and just to kind of put a final point on it. If we're putting a lot of investment in carbon capture and storage in the oil sector, and we find out that due to global demand, oil, Canadian oil simply isn't needed in 20 years, then we're basically going to be making a whole lot of stranded investments in protecting a sector that's going to be naturally declining outside of our control. So net zero, a new way of thinking. It's an inclusive frame. We need to think about, as we're doing this, resilience, Indigenous reconciliation, job creation, competitiveness, health, equity, all part of the solution. Transition pathways thinking is the way to go. So not a technical or economic modeling exercise. It's really a human betterment endeavor. Investments must prioritize the real and immediate reductions. And just to finish off, we've got clear and well-known pathways, and we need to be investing in those now. So with that, I'll wrap up, and thank you very much for paying attention to me.
Thank you very, very much, Bruce. That was an excellent presentation, and we really appreciate it. We maybe have time for one or two questions. If there's anyone that wants to put anything in the ask your questions in the chat, and then I'll be happy to ask Bruce any questions. The first question that I have is just briefly, Bruce, if and thank you so much for the presentation, because I love presentations like this that are both grounded in fact as well as hopeful and thoughtful about the future. Given that we are in the pandemic, this seems to me to be a great time to really think about how we make that transition to net zero but also how we make a transition in our thinking and our expectations about the future. Do you have any ideas about how we do that? How we shift from kind of a consumption-based economy without regard for, uh, a great deal of the ecological implications of things, or what are your recommendations about that? How do we capture this moment, as Machiavelli, or was it Winston Churchill said, and never let a good crisis go, unexploited.
Yes,
This is a
yeah.
crisis. How do we tap into this challenge right now and make people think differently?
Yeah. No, that's a good question, John. I think, and I agree with you. I think this is a very particular point in time, and I mean, we're seeing a lot of complex challenges. I was talking to the academic and writer Tad Homer Dixon yesterday, and he talks about the poly crisis. So we've got this a decline in democracy around the world. We've got increases in populism. We have you know major challenges around the world on sustainability. The economic crises, the pandemic, um, and one thing that we're seeing in all of this, I think, is really a distinction between those governments that are taking a willingness to lead and those governments that are basically stepping back and letting populist ideas interact or not interact. Populist ideas kind of take control of things, with Donald Trump being the obvious example to the south. And so where I see an opportunity, and where I think is more important than ever. And people talk about individual action, but at the end of the day, what individuals need to do is make sure that they're voting for politicians that understand what's important for the future, that understand what's important for society, that are willing to lead. And so personally, I think the pandemic has created a lot of interesting, exposing a lot of interesting kind of differences of approach around the world. But one that we are seeing is some governments are saying, we're going to step in, provide leadership, play a role in helping shape society. And some governments are doing the exact opposite and saying, we're going to step back. It's not the role of government. We're just going to let things unfold. And, my personal view is that the governments that are providing leadership are the ones that are going to succeed. And so the behavior piece, I think, for people, which isn't just buy an electric car and turn your heat down. It's vote for a politician that is going to deliver us the future that we want. And so I'm maybe becoming increasingly more political in my I don't know if increasingly, but anyway, my kind of older age. But I just can't stress enough for young people to be politically active, to understand what the implications are for your future in having a safe and strong democracy.
Thank you very, very much, Bruce, for sharing your insights. I'm sorry we don't have time for too many more questions, but I definitely know people will be joining your breakout room in the future. What I would say before we continue on is that we just wanted to recognize and appreciate what you do, and recognize that your contributions to quality education for SDG number 4, and to provide you with your own impact award for that, for joining us and for all your contributions up to today. So thank you very much for your leadership and your contribution in this way. We're going to take a 2-minute break, and we're going to come back, and we're going to have an excellent talk by Mark Foran, the CIO for Rally Assets, an impact investment firm based here in Canada, and a real thought leader in many ways. So with that, thank you, Bruce, and we're going to take a little break, and then we'll be back right with Mark Foran.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.